Order, order. We start with questions. Secretary of State for Justice. Gagan Mohindra.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will answer questions 1, 10 and 12 together. The last government left us with a record and rising backlog. Cases are taking years to be heard, and the number of victims dropping out has nearly doubled at police stage. We have taken steps to deliver swifter justice, increasing sitting days to a 10-year high and extending magistrates' court sentencing powers, but we must go further. That is why I have commissioned Sir Brian Leveson to conduct a review of the courts, asking him to propose once-in-a-generation reform.
Gagan Mohindra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all want justice to be served as quickly as possible, and many of my constituents have contacted me recently concerned about law and order. Given the various media reports about unused capacity in courts up and down the country, what is her department doing to ensure that every aspect of the justice system is working efficiently and at full capacity?
He makes a good point, and I share his concerns and those of his constituents. Indeed, I see many of those cases in my own advice surgery as a constituency MP. We are working at pace to ensure every bit of the criminal justice system is working to its maximum efficient capacity. That includes everything from police stage right through to sentencing in the courts. He will, I'm sure, be aware of the very strained situation that we inherited. It will take some time for these changes to take effect, but we are driving down on system efficiency, and the Brian Leveson review will give us a policy package to reform the system for the betterment of all victims.
Bradley Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Constituents across Bromsgrove and the villages are sick and tired of violent criminality and lawlessness creeping over the border from Birmingham into our constituency. In the last year, Romsley Co-op and Withall Post Office at Drake's Cross, both of which are on the fringe, the northern fringe of my constituency, have been raided, and it's hard to believe that proximity to Birmingham is not a factor in this. What steps is the Secretary of State taking to ensure that prosecutions are pursued and that custodial sentences are given in the first instance to crack down on crime and make our area safe again?
Secretary of State.
This government is ensuring, with its landmark review into sentencing, that sentencing is fit for purpose and ultimately puts us in a position where we can crack down on re-offending, thereby cutting crime and the number of victims. I'm not sure if he's sort of proposing carving out his part of the world from any other part of the country, but that argument about boundaries can apply to any part of the UK, and that's why we need a functioning justice system for the whole of England and Wales, and that is what this government is going to deliver.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Justice Secretary has said that she agrees with the old legal maxim that justice delayed is justice denied. We currently have a record backlog in the Crown Courts of 73,000. We have rape cases not being prosecuted for 3 or 4 years, and in particular, on any one day, we have 25% of the cases that don't take place for a variety of reasons. So what is the Justice Secretary doing to speed up the whole system?
Well, I mean, I agree with the Chair of the Public Accounts Committee that the backlog is far too high. He will know that no matter what you do, in fact, in terms of system efficiency and capacity, that backlog is projected to rise, and that is because the demand coming into the system is particularly high and is itself rising. He knows that that is why I have asked Sir Brian Leveson to consider once-in-a-generation policy reform so that we can actually make the changes, legislative changes, that are needed to bring that backlog down. That is the change that I think is required alongside system-wide efficiency and productivity as well.
Chair of the Select Committee, Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State's announced 2 major reviews into the criminal justice system, the Leveson Review and the Gawk Review, and said very impressively that they may report by the spring, which could be the 1st of March. There's a difference between reporting and taking action. So could she set out exactly when she expects the results of the 2 reviews to be making a direct impact on case numbers?
So.
Well, the Chair of the Select Committee is tempting me to try to preempt what some of the reviews will find, and that is, of course, what will dictate the pace at which change then occurs. He will be aware of the acute pressure in our prison system, despite the emergency levers that I've had to pull. That has only bought us some time, as I have updated the House regularly about. So the sentencing review measures have to take account of our remaining problem with prison capacity, and therefore we will move quickly once the sentencing review has published to decide which recommendations recommendations we take forward. On the courts package, it is likely any measures will require legislative reform as well. I will, again, with that, seek to move at pace, but that rather depends on the package of measures that Sir Brian Leveson ultimately recommends.
Come to Shadow Secretary of State Robert Geoffrey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the court backlog is growing by 500 cases every month, and the Ministry of Justice has not set a date for when it will come down. Victims are being forced to put their lives on hold whilst they wait for a trial date. And yet, today, at the Old Bailey, half of all the courtrooms sit empty. The Lady Chief Justice said that there are 4,000 additional sitting days available that could be used now. Who is the obstacle to resolving this? Is it the Justice Secretary, who is content for rape trials to be scheduled for as far off as 2027? Or is it the Chancellor, and the Justice Secretary has just had rings run around her by the Treasury?
An absolutely outrageous set of remarks, completely forgetting that only 6 months ago it was his government that was in charge, and it was a government that he was part of that all but ran our justice system into the ground. I don't recall him standing up speaking about delays for rape victims or indeed any other kind of victim when he was on this side of the House. I'm glad he has now realised that the system ought to try and put victims at first. His critique would have more force if it were not for the fact that this is the government, upon coming to office only 6 months ago, that has increased Crown Court sitting capacity by 2,500 days.
Seamus Logan.
Question number 2, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, can I take this opportunity to pay tribute to the essential work our prison staff do? We are committed to improving the retention of experienced staff, as they are vital to keeping our prisons running. The Lord Chancellor has requested advice from officials on the pension age of prison officers, and we will continue to engage with trade unions as this is considered.
Seamus Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his warm words and his encouraging remarks. But he will know that in Scotland the 68 is Too Late campaign by the Prison Officers Association enjoys cross-party and Scottish Government support. But the UK Government has refused to take action on this important issue. The current retirement terms ignore the reality of the frontline role that prison officers perform in prisons on a daily basis across the UK, a dangerous role, no less so than firefighters or the police, who enjoy very different terms. While justice is devolved to the Scottish Parliament, the pensions of Scottish prison officers are controlled by the UK Government. So will the Minister or the Secretary of State commit to his government to reviewing the current prison officer retirement age of 68? And will he meet with me to hear this case in more detail?
As I've already said, the Lord Chancellor has requested advice on this matter, Mr. Speaker. We promote our strong employee total reward package as part of our recruitment. The terms and conditions of the Civil Service Pension Scheme are some of the best in the public sector, with a low employee contribution rate and a significant employer contribution rate of 28.97%. But that doesn't mean it isn't a right and proper question to ask. And if the member wishes to have a meeting with me, I'm quite happy to meet with him.
John Whitby.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer question 3, 4, 13 and 18 together. This government's plan to support women is clear and ambitious, to reduce the number of women going to prison and to have fewer women's prisons. Our Women's Justice Board, which met for the first time last week, will support implementing this vision. I would also like to remind the House that as Youth Justice Minister, I've initiated a review of the placement of girls in custody, which Susanna Hancock is reporting on at the end of this month.
Mr. Speaker. What family support is available for women at Foston Hall Prison and Young Offenders Institution?
Can I thank my honourable friend for his question? We know that family support is very important to women in custody. That's why grant funding has been awarded to the charity Parents and Children Together, PACT, to provide a resettlement family engagement worker in HMP Foston Hall, as well as in 7 other women's prisons.
Jen Kirkham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent's mother, Gay Delap, was recalled to prison just before Christmas, despite complying with her curfew conditions, because the government's electronic monitoring services contractor couldn't fulfil its contract and find a tag to fit a frail 78-year-old woman. Can the Minister and the Secretary of State help to find a solution so that Gay de Lapp can be released on her curfew and so that women are not disadvantaged by the failings of the contractor's electronic monitoring system?
Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising this matter? In this case, the court's decision was to impose a prison sentence, and neither ministers nor officials can intervene in sentences passed down by our independent courts. Still, I do understand the frustrations here, and I can assure the House that we are working hard to find alternative approaches to ensure a secure resolution to this issue.
Paul Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are more than 3,000 women prisoners in England and Wales. A number the Ministry of Justice projects will rise to 4,200 by November 2027. Like many, I welcome the newly established Women's Justice Board that will oversee efforts to tackle this issue and ensure a tailored approach to female offenders. Can I ask the Minister what measures are being implemented to provide support through community sentences and residential women's centres?
Thank my honourable friend. We are awarding £7.2 million for the upcoming year to community organisations and local areas already supporting women in the community. And we're also employing options to increase the use of residential provision as an alternative to short custodial sentences. This includes engaging with the judiciary to ensure that the option of a community order with a residential requirement is considered in appropriate cases.
Becky Gittins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the launch of the Women's Justice Board to reduce the number of women in our prisons, to cut reoffending and to better support our children. Will the Minister work with organisations from across the country, including North Wales Women's Centre, to not only ensure that their voices are at the heart of the work that's to go on, but to also make sure that they have the resources and the support going forward to really support those most vulnerable in our society?
Minister.
I'd like to pay tribute to the women's centres across the country like that in North Wales for their excellent contribution and work that they do. I agree that short custodial sentences can be problematic. They exacerbate women's underlying needs without allowing time for rehabilitation. They separate mothers from children and mean women are more likely to reoffend. That's why the Women's Justice Board, and I'm grateful for my honourable friends welcoming this, aims to increase the number of women supported in the community. The board will also look at how we can better support mothers with young children.
Mr. Ashley Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister accept that allowing biological men into women's prisons increases the risk to female offenders? And does he further accept that only biological women should be housed in women's prisons?
Minister.
The vast majority of transgender prisoners are in men's prisons. We have continued the policy that the last government have. As always, all policies are always under review.
Colin Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Across the UK, we do face the bizarre and worrying reality that common sense protections for women are being dismissed. In Northern Ireland, for example, a motion to ensure biologically male prisoners who identify as women are held in male prisons has been opposed by many elected representatives in the NI Assembly, an issue that extends across the UK. What assurances, and we want assurances, can the Minister give that women's safety is taken seriously and that they are guaranteed single-sex spaces in prisons and other settings free from biological males who identify as women?
Minister.
Safe spaces for women is crucial and is a number one priority of everything we do.
Jim Allister.
Thank you very much. The Minister refers to keeping under review the question of the placing of biological men in women's prisons. Will he ensure, by speaking to the Justice Minister in Northern Ireland, that she reviews that policy? Because only last week she was defending the very policy which puts women at risk from biological men claiming to be the right to be retained in women's prisons.
Minister.
This is a devolved matter, and clearly if there are issues, we're very happy to speak to the devolved government about these issues.
Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Question 5, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, I am sure the whole House will join me in saying that our thoughts today are with the victims of these horrific crimes and their families. Last week, we saw a measure of justice done, but over a number of years, there was widespread state failure that meant this attacker was not stopped. It is right that there will be an inquiry. The Ministry of Justice will play its full part, and I will ensure that any lessons for us are learned.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, when the tragedy of Southport happened, crucial details about the case couldn't be revealed to ensure the trial didn't collapse and the vile perpetrator did not walk away a free man. But some on social media were playing by different rules. Does the Secretary of State think that our contempt laws are fit for the modern world?
My honourable friend raises an important point. The government would not say anything that would risk collapsing this trial. The media followed the law, so did everyone in this House. But the same was not true of what happened online. As the Prime Minister himself has said, this is clearly a challenge that must be addressed. The Law Commission is currently reviewing contempt laws. We look closely at that work and consider these issues in the round.
Sir Desmond Swain.
The information released shortly before the trial didn't collapse the case. Had it been released in August, it might have had a dampening effect on those very unhelpful voices on social media. Might it not?
Well, as I said in my previous answer, it's clear that the fast-moving pace of the online world does have some significant challenges for our present arrangements around contempt laws. I think the approach of the government in making sure that we did nothing that could risk collapsing this trial was the right one. I hope that that will have support across this House. It would have been in no one's interest to take any risks with the safety of the trial itself. But as I say, I do think that the online space does pose some challenges for our contempt law arrangements, and that is something that the Law Commission is rightly looking at.
Sir Secretary Robert Jenrick.
Contempt of court laws are guardrails that ensure fair trials. Does the Justice Secretary accept that, as the independent reviewer of terrorist legislation has said, in failing to provide basic information to the public that has been disclosed in previous cases, information which would not prejudice a trial, the authorities created a vacuum in which misinformation spread? Misinformation which itself may be prejudicial to the trial? And does she agree that in an age in which most people, consume their news through social media, saying nothing is not cost-free? And will she commit to reviewing this now, not waiting for the Law Commission?
Well, I mean, there will always be differing views amongst lawyers about what can and cannot be said. It is right that the government took its own position and that we did not do anything that could risk collapsing this trial. I am agreeing with him that the online world does pose a significant challenge to our contempt laws. That is why that is already being looked at, because there is a piece of work already underway. Don't want to preempt where that would potentially land. The Law Commission has a good track record of considering major law changes, but of course, because of the inquiry and the fast-moving nature of these things, it's something that I'm going to keep under close review myself.
Annalise Midgley.
Question number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. By failing to attend their sentencing hearings, criminals add insult to injury and deny victims and their families a vital part of seeing justice done. I'll be legislating to give judges the power to order attendance at sentencing hearings, and I will make it clear in the law that reasonable force can be used to make sure that this happens. The Prime Minister and I met with Cheryl Corbell last week to discuss these proposals, and we will ensure that the families of other victims are involved before the bill is put before the House.
Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for her positive response and for her and the Prime Minister meeting with me and my constituent Cheryl Corbell, mother of Olivia Pratt Corbell, the 9-year-old who was tragically murdered in 2022. Cheryl is pleased that the Government have committed to implementing Olivia's law without delay. Can the Minister ensure that Cheryl is involved in the development of this law, placing victims and their families at the heart of the justice system?
Secretary.
I thank my honourable friend, and can I pay tribute to her for the work that she's doing on behalf of her constituents, and I was very pleased to be able to discuss these matters with her as well. She's absolutely right. It is crucial that we make progress in this area. We have committed to introducing that legislation before the summer, and I will, of course, as promised last week, consult with Olivia's family as well as the families of other victims where attendance at sentencing hearings has caused problems.
Gregory Cam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are indeed a small number of people who, through due process, appear in court, are convicted, and at the sentencing period decline to come up to the courtroom. The government, the Minister, has indicated her intention to move. Does she agree with me that the government need to show a very robust approach so that people who show disdain and contempt for the rule of law are shown that there is no room for manoeuvre and they must and will appear in court?
Secretary.
He is absolutely right. It is already expected that defendants attend sentencing hearings, but of course we know that some use it as an opportunity to not face the families of their victims, and it causes huge trauma to some of those families. We will be clarifying and putting on a statutory footing the expectation of attendance at sentencing hearings, with also measures of sanctions in order to deal with those offenders who still, despite being compelled to attend court, even with the use of reasonable force, seek to disrupt those hearings.
Richard Holden.
Question number 7, please, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 7 and 19 together. This government inherited a situation where 10% of offenders account for 50% of all offences. We've also inherited an epidemic of shoplifting, the kind of an antisocial crime that blights communities. I have commissioned David Gauke to review how sentences could be reformed to address prolific offending, with a particular aim to use sentences to reduce reoffending, cut crime and ultimately make our streets safer.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Now, I believe in second chances, perhaps even more chances in some cases, but the Excellent Policy Exchange report, The Wicked and Redeemable, a long-term plan to fix the criminal justice system, found that hyper-prolific offenders, those with more than 45 previous convictions, are sent to prison in fewer than half of occasions when they are subsequently convicted of an indictable or either-way offence. Given that these people, Mr. Speaker, commit such high levels of crime, which affects usually the least affluent of our constituents, what consideration has the government made of the report's recommendations, particularly that introduction of a mandatory 2-year sentence for when hyper-prolific offenders are subsequently convicted of an indictable or either-way offence?
Secretary.
He raises a very important point that blights communities all across the country, and I agree with him that we need a specific strategy to deal with prolific offenders. Of course, different organisations use different definitions of what counts as either a prolific offender or indeed a hyper-prolific offender, but that's why I've asked David Gauke in the Independent Sentencing Review to look specifically at this cohort of offenders, because the revolving door of prison or other type of sentences for them clearly is not having an impact. So we have to think about the interventions that will make the biggest difference to the largest number of this type of offender, so that we can cut crime and have fewer victims in the process.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Lord Chancellor rightly says less than 10% of criminals account for nearly half of crime. I understand a sentencing review is underway, but any decisions are for ministers to make. Will the Right Honourable Lady please rule out here and now any possibility of allowing career criminals to avoid prison, even for short sentences?
Secretary.
Well, she will know that I'm not going to preempt any of the potential findings of the sentencing review. The point of having an independent review is to allow them to take a look at all of these issues in the round. I've made it very clear that I'm particularly concerned about those people that she rightly terms as career criminals, and I'm particularly keen to think about the interventions that can make the biggest difference so that we can reduce this blight in our communities. I think that is a clear statement of intent from this government about how seriously we treat prolific offending, but the specific measures that we choose to take forward will be clearer once the sentencing review has reported.
Dr. Kieran Mullen, Shadow Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the Secretary of State has mentioned, the approach to managing hyper-prolific offenders is part of David Gauke's review, considering the wider use of GPS tagging and home curfew, for example. But the Department has been undertaking its own assessment of the effectiveness of GPS tagging in their current operation. Will the government commit to that review being published before or alongside the sentencing review, so that we can properly judge the merits of any proposed expansion?
Secretary.
I will, as I have sought to do throughout this process, ensure transparency of in the government's approach, not just on the data in respect of emergency releases, but also some of the other information that underpins the future policy choices that we may make.
Dr. Kieran.
I don't think I quite heard a yes, but I'll take that as an encouraging commitment that she will publish the review ahead of any sentencing review. But I'm afraid in their discussion of these issues, ministers risk losing sight of the fact that imprisonment also serves an important purpose in punishing offenders in the interests of justice. So importantly, how will the government decide whether any proposals put forward by David Gauke are accepted in relation to whether they sufficiently punish offenders? How will you make that judgment before accepting any recommendations?
Secretary.
Well, he will know, I have said this in this House on many occasions, I believe in punishment, and I also believe in prison, and prison has a core role to play in the punishment of offenders. We cannot be in a situation in this country, however, where we're running out of prison places. So we have to be able to find a way to balance the need to punish and to imprison people, and also make interventions that expand the use of punishment outside of prison as well. He says from his sedentary position, build more. We are moving forward with the 14,000 prison place deficit left by his government at the last election. This government will build prisons, but as he well knows, we cannot build our way out of the prison capacity crisis, so we have to consider other measures as well. But let me be very clear, we will always seek to punish offenders, and prison will always have a place, and this government will make sure we build more prison places than the previous government did.
Luke Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question 8, please.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I will answer questions 8 and 20 together. We took immediate action to prevent the collapse of the prison system by implementing STS 40. We're building 14,000 new prison places and have published our 10-year capacity strategy, and we've launched an independent sentencing review aiming to ensure that we can never run out of prison places again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the actions the government are taking to increase prison capacity, but I have to say I am worried about youth custody, and my local police force are particularly concerned that there is simply not enough space in the secure custodial estate, and many vulnerable young people are at risk of being exploited by organised criminal gangs. I understand this is less to do with young offenders institutions and more to do with the lack of capacity in secure children's homes, which has fallen since 2010. And the number of MOD contracted spaces is now only around 100 for the entire country, which is appalling. So can the Minister set out the steps he will be taking, working with DfE, to increase capacity, protect vulnerable young people and protect our residents?
We certainly do not wish to reduce capacity. I can confirm we do contract with local authorities to secure children's homes and place children to these beds. In 2010 we contracted for 191 beds and currently we contract for 103. This correlates to the decrease in the numbers of young people in custody. Most done over that period when the party opposite were in government. We do not currently intend to reduce overall capacity in youth custody service estate, which comprises YOI, STC, secure school and SCH beds. We are, however, recommissioning secure children's homes contracts and cannot predetermine the outcome of that exercise, but I can assure him we will not run out of spaces.
Seamus.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The annual report into prison capacity reported in December that of the 88,400 prison places available, 97% of those are occupied. Now, the same report said that by 2032, it estimates that we'll have a prison capacity of about 99,000. But the central estimate for the number of prisoners stands at 104,100. Can the Minister tell us what this government will do to ensure that everybody who commits a crime worthy of prison is indeed sent to prison?
I can absolutely assure my honourable friend that that will be the case. People who commit the crime worthy of prison will be sent to prison. As we have assured the House, we have plans to build 14,000 new prison places as set out in our 10-year capacity strategy. In 6 months, we've added 500 prison places. It took 14 years for the party opposite to add 500 prison places. We've also launched an independent sentencing review aiming to ensure we never run out of places again. Taken together, these measures will ensure the country do not have more prisoners than we have space for in our prisons.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for his answer. Minister, when it comes to building capacity, one of the things that concerned myself and indeed many in this chamber is those who have served in the armed forces, veterans, those who live with PTSD, those who live with emotional memories and nightmares of the lives that they have done in commitment and in uniform to this country. So can I ask the Minister a very specific question? What can be done extra to ensure that our veterans are looked after better when it comes to prison capacity? They have demons they fight with every day. We have to look after them.
Well, the Armed Forces Covenant affects all of us, and HMPPS ensures that the issues around veterans are properly addressed with the individuals concerned to give the proper support that they need.
And this will be
9, please, Mr. Speaker.
This government is committed to supporting victims and survivors of violence against women and girls. These are abhorrent crimes. That's why we are funding, to the tune of £26 million, the Rape and Sexual Abuse Fund, as well as funding independent domestic and sexual violence advocates. We're also strengthening the powers of the Victims Commissioner to improve accountability where those victims' needs are not being met.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A constituent of mine from Somerset was seriously sexually assaulted in another county over 2 years ago. She reported it in 2022, but she's been given a court date in December 2025. She's told me the legal process with both the courts and the relevant police service has been more traumatising than the incident itself. What better support can we offer women who find themselves stuck in these processes for such lengths of time?
I'm terribly sorry to hear of the case that she raises, and we know that those cases are not isolated. That's exactly why this government is bearing down on the Crown Court backlog. We're increasing the number of Crown Court sitting days. We're increasing magistrate sentencing powers to free up capacity in the Crown Court, precisely so that we can get swifter justice for victims. It's also right that we're investing in victim transformation programme through the CPS to provide precisely the sorts of support that would benefit your constituent, to keep her engaged in the process and, as I said, bring those trial dates forward.
Chris Webb.
Mr. Speaker, it's been revealed that just 4% of rape and sexual offences reported to Lancashire Police in the last year resulted in a charge or summons. What steps will her department take to restore confidence in the criminal justice system for constituents of mine in Blackpool South?
I thank him for his question. He will know that this government has a landmark ambition to halve violence against women and girls, and the criminal justice system has an important part to play in that. By setting that priority, while setting that priority, whether it's for the CPS, for our police, we want to drive charging decisions, we want to drive up that conviction rate. But as I said, providing swifter justice for victims is going to require once-in-a-generation reform to bring down the Crown Court backlog.
Joshua Brindo, the Liberal Democrats, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Via a written parliamentary question recently, I asked the government how many domestic abusers are there in prison and what is their reoffending rate. Under the system they inherited from the Conservatives, they said it is not possible to robustly calculate the number. This is shocking, and it's because, in one part, there is no specific offence of domestic abuse in the law to properly reflect and recognise these crimes. My domestic abuse aggravated offences bill would correct that loophole. When will the Secretary of State honour her commitment made on Good Morning Britain to meet with me to discuss my bill and discuss how we can better protect victims and survivors?
Tackling domestic abuse is a priority for this government. The Domestic Abuse Act sets out a broad statutory definition of domestic abuse, and it's improving our understanding of the wide range of behaviours that can constitute this abuse. It's also right to say that domestic abuse, whilst not constituting a standalone offence, is considered an aggravating factor routinely throughout our criminal justice system, and rightly so. That's the reason that data is not collected, and that is the position that we will maintain.
Roberts.
Section 11.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I need to find my place. Right. The Honourable Lady is right to raise this issue. We're inherited historic underinvestment in maintenance and a rising prison population. That's why we have already published our 10-year prison capacity strategy and have plans to invest £220 million in prison and probation service maintenance in 24-25 and up to £300 million in 25-26.
Ms Savile Roberts.
Very honourable, and I rise as the co-chair of the Justice Union's parliamentary group. And of course, this emergency extra money to tackle the squalid state of our prisons, of course, it's welcome. But the reality is it won't touch the sides with a maintenance backlog of £2 billion. And this shows exactly why the privatisation of prison maintenance is a failed model. Private contractors may win contracts on low bids, but the billions come in as extra cost later. Does he seriously think that current prison maintenance providers offer good service and value for money to the taxpayer?
Yeah.
The Honourable Lady is right. We inherited contracts which were already well progressed for best value for money, and to be able to move things forward quickly, we therefore decided to keep going on that process. It was important to do that. But I can assure the House that we have an open mind regarding private and public sector contracts in the future. The important thing is to get best value for money and get the job done.
Mahmood.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Katie Allen was a beautiful and bright young woman and would have been a constituent of mine, but for the fact that aged 21 she found herself after a youthful, stupid mistake in Pullman Young Offenders Institute, where she died from suicide. The fatal accident inquiry recently published into her death and the death of William Brown found that they might have both been alive today were it not for a catalogue of errors by the Scottish Prison Service. The families of those who've lost children in such circumstances are campaigning for Crown immunity to be removed from prisons across Britain, so that there is proper accountability and so that more young lives are not lost. Would the Minister meet with those families to discuss that proposal?
I thank the honourable friend for his question, and he draws attention to a deeply disturbing case. I am very happy to meet with the families concerned and himself.
Peter Bedford.
Mr Speaker, the last government gave the public plenty of reasons to lose confidence in the justice system, a rising courts backlog and prisons on the edge of collapse. We have already averted a crisis in our prisons and have raised Crown Court capacity to a 10-year high, and we are now embarking on reform in both our courts and our prisons. The work of restoring confidence in the justice system has started. It will, of course, take some time.
Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Jason Hoganson was wrongly released under the government's early release scheme. Last week, he was convicted of assaulting his ex-partner just a day after he was freed under this botched scheme. Does the Minister agree with me? This shocking case and cases like it continue to undermine the public's trust and confidence in our justice system.
Secretary.
I think what undermines confidence in the justice system is running out of prison places, which is the inheritance that the Conservative government left for this government. That is the mess that we are cleaning up. He will also be aware that the previous government's end of custody supervised licence scheme was also itself an early release scheme, but without any of the specific measures on accountability, transparency and the wider set of exclusions that we introduced with the SDS 40 scheme.
Jonathan Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. On Friday, I met with my constituent, Hayley Johns, and she has given me permission to share her story in this place. Hayley was a victim of domestic abuse and actual bodily harm perpetrated by an ex-partner, and I was absolutely shocked to hear her story. Her ex-partner was convicted for 3 years for his crimes. However, he's been considered for release after serving just 3 months. Does she agree with me that after the legacy of the previous government, we now need to redouble our efforts and the efforts of this government to improve confidence in the criminal justice system? And can I please ask her to take a personal interest in this case?
Secretary.
Well, I'll happily look at the facts of that case. I'm afraid some of those numbers don't sound like that should be possible, but that could be down to specific factors in relation to that case. So if he writes to me with the details, I'll make sure he has a full response.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Jab Babrin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Confidence in the criminal justice system can only be achieved if support for victims and survivors is adequately funded. But charities such as Victim Support, whose services I've personally benefited from, have said that the employer NIC's hike amounts to a real terms budget cut for them of 7%. Victims need more support, not less. So will the Secretary of State fight to reverse this damaging cut to help restore those victims' confidence in the criminal justice system?
Secretary.
Well, he will be aware of the difficult fiscal inheritance for this government and that we've had to make some difficult choices. We received a good settlement from the Treasury at the last budget, but that's not without its challenges given the high demand in our system. He will know that we have protected victims, funding for victims of violence against women and girls in particular, including on rape and sexual offences as well. So we have sought to protect the most vulnerable victims throughout the process of making decisions on our victims' funding packages.
Sir John Hayes.
Question 15, Mr Speaker.
Secretary.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The honourable member raises a very important point on these heinous gangs and the crimes that they commit. The 20 recommendations made by Alexis Jay in her independent inquiry into child sexual abuse were ignored for far too long. This government is working at pace to respond to them. We will also legislate to make grooming an aggravating factor in the sentencing of child sexual offences, ensuring that the punishment fits these horrific crimes.
Sir John.
I was in Bradford last week. More of the gangsters, the grooming gangsters, who largely of Pakistani origin, raped white girls there and elsewhere. The paucity of the Home Secretary's audit, by which authorities mark their own homework, was made clear. So will the Justice Secretary agree to a wide-ranging review of these matters with statutory powers? For surely those whose lives have been ruined and those who may be deserve more than the weak reticence of people with power who refuse to face the facts.
Secretary.
Well, I hope he and I will have a shared objective in being clear that there is a desire on all sides of this House to make sure we face the full facts and the victims of these heinous crimes get the justice that they deserve. I'm sorry to hear that there are concerns about the Home Secretary ordered audit in Bradford. I will ensure that those concerns are passed on to the Home Secretary. He will be aware that these matters fall directly within the purview of the Home Department, but his concerns are ones that I will ensure that I pass on.
Volunteer.
Question 16, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for this question. The number of children in custody has reduced significantly over the last decade, but now those detained are a more complex and violent cohort. Our turnaround programme funds youth offending teams to intervene early to address child offending. Only 5% of children completing these interventions received convictions in the first year of the programme. We're continuing to take stock of what more can be done.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last week, tragically, 12-year-old Leo Ross was stabbed to death in Birmingham as he was returning home from school. His 14-year-old killer had been arrested by the police several times in the past for violent offences in the months running up to the killing. Can the Minister tell me what the Government is doing to reform the youth justice system to prevent and address knife crime amongst our young people, resulting in terrible tragedies like we saw last week?
Minister.
I'm deeply saddened by this tragic crime. My thoughts and everybody else's thoughts will go out to the family of Leo Ross. These horrific events underline just how important it is for us to deliver our manifesto commitment that every young person caught in possession of a knife is referred to a youth offending team with appropriate action taken. We are also piloting a new, more robust form of community punishment for children involving mandatory GPS monitoring and intensive supervision.
Lisa Smart.
Please, Mr Speaker.
Applications for deputyship by the Court of Protection play a vital role where individuals need to apply to make decisions for a loved one who lacks capacity. It's important then to support those individuals through prompt and efficient processes. Her Majesty's Court Service has been implementing an improvement plan, driving down wait times by recruiting more staff, enhancing judicial capacity, digitising application forms and implementing a new case management system.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. One of my Hazel Grove constituents contacted me to ask why he's been waiting 9 long months for a decision from the Court of Protection on his deputyship application. He needs to secure this to allow him to make crucial decisions for a vulnerable loved one. And another constituent in a similar position waited for 2 months without any acknowledgement that his application was being looked into. Their experiences are not unique. Solicitors and judges alike acknowledge the systemic delays plaguing this system. Does the Minister agree with me that delays in processing times of this length are unacceptable, and what does she think is acceptable?
Well, I agree with her. Those sorts of delays are not acceptable, and I'm sorry to hear about the distress that that will have caused. That is why it's right that we continue to invest in our improvement plan, that we continue to see progress in digitisation. Digitising the application forms is a first step, but we want to see end-to-end digitisation, which we know is resulting in decent progress and speeding up those times over recent months. There is more to do, and we shall do it.
Duffield.
Mr. Speaker, question 21.
As I said, this government is committed to halving violence against women and girls within a decade. This is an important ambition, and the criminal justice system has a vital role to play in that. As part of that, in November, we launched a pilot into promoting domestic abuse protection orders in selected areas, and we have ambitions to roll that out further. In addition, we will also introduce independent legal advisors for adult rape victims, ensuring that victims have legal support that they need and that they deserve.
Rosie Duffield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner found that just 5% of reported domestic abuse results in a conviction. 5%. Does the Minister share my concerns that lengthy investigations into non-crime hate incidents are potentially diverting vital resources from the criminal justice system from prosecuting actual violence against women and girls?
Solicitor General.
She is right to remark on the low charging and low conviction rates in the area of domestic abuse. It's why we've got an ambition to drive that up. It's why we're putting more funding and more prioritisation, calling on our agencies, whether it's the police, the CPS, to really focus in this area, because right now we are not doing enough for women and girls.
Mr. Strathern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The tragic reality for many women who suffer domestic abuse and then have to go through family court proceedings on top of this is that the presumption of parental contact provides another opportunity for perpetrators of domestic abuse to continue to prolong that. The Government is rightly reviewing this, and will Ministers make sure we make the most of this opportunity to better protect women who suffer domestic abuse through the family court system?
Solicitor General.
He is right to make this point. Our family courts should never become sites of re-traumatisation for victims of domestic abuse. We are reviewing the presumption, and when we are ready to, we will publish the findings and also our policy response to that review.
Come to Topical, Charlotte Craig.
Question number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, this government inherited a record and rising Crown Court backlog and prisons on the point of collapse, breeding grounds for crime that create better criminals, not better citizens. The work of restoring safer streets in this country will be long and hard, but we are taking immediate action. Since the last Justice Orals, we increased the number of sitting days in the Crown Court by 2,000 this financial year and boosted criminal legal aid by up to £92 million a year to get cases moving through the courts more quickly. We have published a 10-year prison capacity strategy, setting out plans to build 14,000 new prison places and ensure we always have the space to lock up dangerous criminals. And we launched the Women's Justice Board with one clear goal: to send fewer women to prison. Mr. Speaker, we are doing what it takes to deliver swifter justice for victims and punishment that cuts crime.
Charlotte Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Ministers have talked quite a bit today about expanded powers for Magistrates' Court. Could the Minister tell me what additional funding is being made available and what training for magistrates to assist them with this expanded role?
Well, the changes in relation to Magistrates' Court sentencing powers were changes that had been made by the previous government. They were working well. They were changed by the previous government due to prison capacity issues. We've restored those same powers, so I don't think that some of those issues around training are necessarily engaged. However, we will make sure that legal advisors and the full package of measures that magistrates need to fulfil their obligations are in place.
Peter Swallow.
What support has the Ministry of Justice put in place for those serving IPP sentences, especially where they have additional needs?
It is right that IPP sentences were abolished. Last week I hosted a roundtable for MPs to discuss their concerns about IPP sentence and share the work the department is doing. The Prisons Minister, in the other place, hosted a similar roundtable for peers. We're determined to make further progress towards a safe and sustainable release for those serving the IPP, whilst recognising that at all times public protection is paramount.
Shadow Secretary Robert Jenrick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 weeks ago, 3 grooming gang members were sentenced for the most appalling rapes of children at Bradford Crown Court, but they only received 6, 7 and 9-year sentences, respectively. 6 years, out on licence in 4 for the rape of a child. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that these sentences are disgracefully short? And will she commit to using the sentencing review to mandate full life sentences for these evil people? If she will, she'll have our support.
Justice Secretary.
Well, let me say we have a shared objective in making sure that these evil individuals feel the full force of the law. He will understand. I will not comment on individual sentencing decisions. I would hope that that is a decision that the Shadow Lord Chancellor might also wish to reflect upon. It is not appropriate given our collective commitment to the independence of the judiciary. However, as I said in response to earlier questions, we will be legislating to make grooming an aggravating factor, and this government will make sure that victims get the justice they deserve.
Robert Jenrick.
Thank you. Well, I've written to the Attorney-General asking him to review those sentences as potentially unduly lenient. But 2 of the men who were sentenced at Bradford Crown Court for grooming gang offences were absent. They are thought to have absconded abroad. Can the Justice Secretary confirm how many grooming gang defendants the government is currently pursuing overseas, and what efforts are being made by the government with, in this case, the Pakistani authorities using every lever of the British state to locate these evil men and get justice for the victims?
Justice Secretary.
Well, I will happily write to him with details in relation to the specific case that he raises. He is right that we have international agreements and arrangements with other jurisdictions to ensure that offenders can be brought back to face justice in this country. I'm sure that those arrangements are being applied appropriately, but I will make sure that he gets the fuller answer on the case that he has raised.
Lord Hatton.
Mr. Speaker, today we learned that not only did Evgeny Prigozhin, a sanctioned warlord, use frozen funds to make legal threats to silence a British journalist, but also that the enablers of this textbook example of lawfare have since gone unpunished, the SRA ruling that Prigozhin's lawyers broke no rules. This inaction, when faced with such clear-cut wrongdoing, shows that our current framework is inadequate. Can the Minister outline what steps they are taking to create a tough deterrent against harmful lawfare tactics, particularly when they are deployed by insidious individuals like Prigozhin?
I thank him for his question and for the campaigning work that he's doing in this area. Journalism is the lifeblood of democracy, and slaps represent an abuse of the legal system used by those with deep pockets to harass and silence journalism. This behaviour is intolerable. My focus and the focus of this government will be on the implementation of the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, which introduced an early dismissal mechanism and cost protection for slap defendants.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last September, the Secretary of State confirmed to me that foreign national offenders blocking up our jails were being removed and deported. So could she update the House on how many have been removed and deported? And does she agree with me that the fastest way to free up capacity in our prisons is to remove the vast majority of them?
Yep. I agree with him. We need to be ensuring we're doing everything we can to remove foreign national offenders from our prisons. Between the 5th of July 2024 and the 4th of January 2025, 2,580 foreign national offenders have been returned. That's a 23% increase on the same period a year ago, and we are currently on track to remove more foreign national offenders this year than at any time in recent years.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Humanist marriage has been legal in Scotland for 20 years, but continues to wait an order to be legalised in England and Wales. The Law Commission made recommendations 2 years ago on clarifying the law, but when asked to set out a timetable for action, the Minister in the other place could only respond in the fullness of time. Can the Minister here set out that timetable, or alternatively say when they will make an order to end the long wait for humanist marriage?
Solicitor General.
I understand that the humanists have been campaigning for legally binding humanist weddings. The government is committed to strengthening the rights and protections available in particular to women in cohabiting couples. We will look at the Law Commission's work and we will publish our response in due course.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Gambling with Lives is a charity that supports families who are bereaved from gambling-related suicide. Jo from Clumpton lost her son Daniel to gambling suicide and speaks very powerfully on it.
What is the Minister doing to have accurate data recorded for each death that is linked to gambling?
Minister.
Well, can I just express how sorry I am to hear of his constituent's case? It's something that I am happy to write to him about. It's quite a specific question, but it's important that we provide support to all sorts of victims. That's why we have the Victims Code, strengthening the power of the Victims Commissioner, but I will write to him on that specific matter.
Jake Richards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, the Court of Appeal overturned a first instance decision regarding the anonymity of a judge presiding over the tragic Sarah Sharif case in the family courts. I don't expect the government to comment on individual cases, and it's certainly not about that individual judge. But will the government use this as an opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to open justice and press freedom?
Minister.
Well, as he rightly says, I won't comment on the specific case, but the principle of open justice and transparency in our legal system is one that, of course, that we adhere to. It's why we have the publication of sentencing remarks, transcripts, and indeed broadcasting of many of our hearings, so that the public can see exactly how justice in this country is administered.
Katie Lamb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the Attorney-General has recused himself from advising the government, but he will not tell us what for, and he still refuses to be transparent about potential payments by former clients. Does the Secretary of State for Justice really not believe the public has a right to know?
Justice Secretary.
She should know that there are robust processes in place in government that were in place for the previous administration as well, that manage the dealing of conflicts of interest, and it's not something that any government minister will be giving a running commentary on.
Chair of the Select Committee, Andy Schlott.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We just witnessed the Chair of the Criminal Cases Review Commission being priced out of her job 6 months after the Secretary of State described her as unable to fulfil her duties. When will a new chair be appointed, and will this be accompanied by a wider review of the CCRC to restore confidence in that damaged organisation?
Minister.
Well, he is absolutely right that we need to restore confidence in the CCRC. That is why we are taking the decision to appoint an interim chair to steady the ship, but more importantly, to implement the recommendations of the Henley Review so that we can restore confidence in this very, very important institution, particularly in light of the appalling miscarriage of justice in the case of Andrew Malkinson.
Andrew Rosenwell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With an ever-increasing prison population and the monumental delays experienced in the courts and throughout the justice system, what steps is the Secretary of State taking to address the significant delays that arise from the period of time required to download and analyse digital material?
Well, he raises an important point. There is much more we believe that can be achieved by increased use of AI and other digital technology to speed up some of the paper processes that create some delays across the criminal justice system. It's work that I, as chair of the Criminal Justice Board, have asked for a cross-system criminal justice response on, and I will update the House in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No doubt we all agree that preventable deaths should be prevented. Tragedies like Hillsborough and Grenfell must not be repeated because we failed to make changes. So I ask the Secretary of State what consideration she's given to creating a national oversight mechanism to ensure that lessons are learned from every state-related death.
The government will shortly be publishing its bill, which I know for campaigners is referred to as Hillsborough Law, but it will reflect on the issues relating to the duty of candour, which this government is committed to. And I know that campaigners are making representations to the Cabinet Office on the national oversight mechanism, which they are currently considering.
Sir David Davis.
Thank you, Speaker. Can the Secretary of State explain to the House under what circumstances are the police and the Crown Prosecution Service allowed to deny access to evidence after a trial is concluded to a defence lawyer seeking to appeal, as has happened in the Lucy Lepre case and I believe in others?
Justice Secretary.
He will appreciate that as the Justice Secretary I am not able to interfere in any independent decisions made by the police or the Crown Prosecution Service, but he has made his point and I will ensure it is dealt with by the appropriate individuals, either the Home Secretary or the head of the CPS.
Nick Timothy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are serious questions about the transparency of the police, the CPS and the government itself in the days and weeks following the Southport attack. In written answers to me, the government has refused to provide the dates when the Prime Minister was told that Ruda Shabana possessed ricin and an Al-Qaeda training manual. Can the Justice Secretary tell me why?
Justice Secretary.
The Prime Minister and the other questions that he has raised that has responded. The appropriate information was made available at the appropriate time to either the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary. It was right that the government doesn't give any commentary that could have collapsed a trial, and he knows on this the specific charge of ricin, that is a decision that does require law officer approval. It was sought and it was immediately given.
Wilf Walster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Justice Secretary is aware of the tragic case of my constituent from Woking, Zara Sharif. Will she consider reforming family courts and ending the presumption in favour of parental contact, despite the fact there are safeguarding concerns?
Minister.
The case of that little girl of Zara Sharif is indeed one of the most tragic of recent times, and I know that that's a view that's shared right across the House. It's why that there's a safeguarding review currently underway to look at all the agencies that were involved and should have been protecting that little girl from those who ended up killing her. We are looking at the presumption. There is a review. We will consider the findings of that review, and we will publish our response to that in due course.
Final question, Lisa Smart.
Mr. Speaker, one of my Hazel Grove constituents, a British citizen and mother of 2 young children, faces the prospect of being forced to return to Poland to accompany those children under the Hague Convention on the Civil Aspects of Child Abduction, having fled escalating domestic abuse. If she does, her inability to speak the language or work will leave her entirely dependent on her abuser, even though he's barred from contacting her. Will the Minister work with me to ensure that domestic abuse is explicitly recognised as a valid defence against return orders of this type?
Minister.
I thank her for her question and in fact would invite her to write to me about that specific case, because it sounds like it throws up a very, very difficult set of factual circumstances, and it's one that I would like the opportunity to consider.
That completes questions. We'll let the front bench change over.